Under the unique circumstances that we find ourselves, we're trying to be, unfortunately, very efficient and timely, and pay our proper respect at the same time to really a great man, Mr. Jack Stewart. So the way we're going to proceed is the following. I'm going to start off by saying a parak of Tehillim, a chapter from Psalms. We'll then have representing against each generation. Ralph will speak as one of the children. Barry will speak on behalf of the grandchildren. And then Rabbi Caruso, who knew him well for his many, many years of service to the Fairmount Temple, will be speaking as the rabbi giving the eulogy. Rabbi Caruso will then shift directly into the Kelmale, and that'll conclude our service so we can get to the cemetery in the appropriate time. We'll do a very appropriate one, Psalm 23. Mizmor LeDavid, Adonai Rawi Lo Echzor, Binos Esha Yarbitzeini, Amei Menuchos Yinahaleini, Nafshi Yishovav Yanchem B'maglei Tzedek L'man Shimo, Kam Ki Elek B'geit Zalmavet Lo Yeraki Ato Imodi, Shiftecha Mishantecha Heimo Yenachamuni, Tarok Lefonai Shulchan Neged Soriroi, Dishanta Vashem En Roshi Kosi Rivoya, Achto V'chesed Yudafuni Ko Yemei Chayai, V'shav Diveis Adonai Liorech Yamim. A song of David, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not lack. God makes me lie down in lush pastures, God leads me beside tranquil waters. God restores my soul and guides me in righteous path for God's name's sake. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your scepter and staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in full view of my adversaries. You've anointed my head with oil. My cup overflows. May only goodness and kindness pursue me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord for length of days. Ralph?
I can safely take off my mask from here, I think. Okay. Hi, I'm Ralph Stewart, Jack's son. My father's life was so full, so rich, so diverse, that I'm not even sure where to begin. So I guess I'll start from the beginning. He had a humble start growing up in Oneida, New York, a small town of only 10,000 people in the geographical center of the state, about 30 miles east of Syracuse. From what my grandmother and he told me, he was quite mischievous as a child. At the age of 3, he pulled down her good curtains from the window. He fell out of a tree when he was a bit older and broke his arm. And he always wanted to hang out with his big brother Herb, who was 7 years his senior, even though Herb and his friends would use this annoying little kid as a punching bag. As a teenager, he often worked in his father's clothing store, the Oneida Men's Shop. So how small was Oneida? Well, there was only one other Jewish student in his class, a girl that everyone wanted him to get together with, but he wanted no part of it. And here's an article from the local newspaper. You can see how yellow it is in time here. It said, the headline says, Jack's turtle back home to stay, took 8 months to return. And it says, Oneida, June 13th, missing since last fall, Peggy, prize-winning turtle, belonging to Jack Silverman, son of Mr. and Mrs. E.J. Silverman of 551 Main Street, returned home recently, none the worse for her 8 months' absence. The turtle, which won a prize in the pet show staged by the City Playground Commission last summer, was released in October by its owner, who had been persuaded that Peggy might enjoy freedom. Jack found the turtle in his backyard recently and stated today that he would not release it again. He knew it was the same turtle as he had carved his initials into its shell. Dad loved music. He learned piano, and as a young teenager, he took accordion lessons every Saturday in Syracuse, riding the bus by himself 30 miles each way. When Eileen, Leslie, and I were young kids, we used to love when he would take out his accordion and play various John Philip Sousa marches. We would start marching all over the house while he played. He later became first clarinetist in the Syracuse University Marching Band, where he received a $200 per semester scholarship for being the band equipment manager, leaving his family only having to pay the remaining $200 tuition per semester. Times have changed. Dad was a great father to us as well as a loving husband to my mother. He wasn't overly demonstrative. While my mother constantly told us she loved us, she would say, "Have I told you I love you today? I love you today." I'm not sure if I can recall Dad telling me he loved me, but there was never any doubt that he did. He worked hard as an engineer to provide for us, and he had many lean years along the way. While we didn't always get what we wanted, we always got what we needed. We never took fancy vacations, although they did manage to take our whole family to Israel for my bar mitzvah. And he was so good to Mom. I never remember them raising their voices to each other at all. During the peak of his career, he had a second engineering office outside of Washington, D.C. in Bethesda, Maryland, working on bombs and torpedoes for the U.S. Navy. He would spend a few nights there every month. We always joked that he had a second wife and family in Washington that he was living with while he was out of town. As I look around here, I don't think I see anyone that would fit that bill, so I guess we were wrong about that after all. And that brings me to the fact that Dad had perhaps the highest moral character of anyone I know. He worked hard and volunteered for so many worthy causes, both Jewish and secular. I don't think I ever heard him swear, and he was just a really good person, outgoing and well-liked by anyone that met him. When we were in Disney World on the way back from my cousin Howard's bar mitzvah in Miami, we drove there, by the way, we were running very late to make it to our reservations for the Hawaiian luau, and we were lost. My father and I stopped at an information booth for directions. The lady told us to follow the black path and we'll get there. My father then pauses and says, "The black path? But we're the good guys." The lady looked confused and said, "What?" To which I had to explain that it was a joke, and an ill-timed one at that, given that we were in such a hurry. But in a sense, he really was unwittingly describing himself. So that brings me to his dry sense of humor, along with a bit of quirkiness. On my older sister Eileen and Reuben's wedding night, Reuben called our house at 2 a.m. I remember this because I answered the phone. He was in a panic and asked to speak to Dad, as he didn't know what happened to an envelope of wedding cash that they were going to take on their honeymoon. My father gets on the phone, and before Reuben could even speak, immediately says, "It's too late, you can't send her back." My parents also always ran on Jewish time, chronically late for many things. My father, along with my mother, loved going to weekly Friday night services at Fairmount Temple. They would always be a little late, though. If my father saw that one of the close-in parking spots reserved for the rabbi was still open, he would just park there. He reasoned that if the rabbi wasn't there by now, he's not coming. My father also always waited up for me to come home at night when I was out on weekends in high school. I came home late one night and saw my father lying on the sofa, reading the newspaper in our family room, with the TV on and our dog Rebel curled up and sleeping on the rug right next to the sofa. I walked in and said, "What's that smell?" Dad said, "What smell?" He puts down his newspaper, and we see that on the rug, right next to the sleeping dog and 2 feet from my father, is a big pile of dog poop. He didn't even notice the dog had pooped right next to him. And of course, when he ate ice cream, he would eat it right out of the box, pouring chocolate syrup and nuts directly in. You always knew he was the last one to have eaten the ice cream, as he would always leave it perfectly leveled off in the box, the true engineer in him. Dad was also an incredible do-it-yourselfer. He fixed and built so many things in their home of 49 years that my Aunt Peppy once said, "This is the house that Jack built." To those too young to recognize that reference, it's an English nursery rhyme that is comparable to Chad Gad Yah. As a child, I used to help him all of the time with his projects, and I credit him with giving me the knowledge and abilities to build and fix so many things in my house as well. My Aunt Peppy was just one of my mother's 7 siblings, most of whom lived in Cleveland at one time or another while we were growing up. Coming from a small immediate family and being geographically distant from them, my father always felt fortunate to be adopted by them and to be able to call them his family as well. He was the same way with my beautiful wife of 32 years, Rachel, making her feel extremely welcome into the family. I'm sure my brothers-in-law, Reuben and Stewart, would feel the same way. In fact, in later years, he and my mother took our entire extended family, including all of the grandchildren, on trips to Florida, to see Mom's family, of course, as well as Los Angeles and Las Vegas. Those trips left wonderful and amusing memories for all of us. Think Marilyn Monroe at Madame Tussauds Wax Museum. Of course, we all know that Dad passed away less than 6 months after Mom died from complications from COVID-19. Due to his moderate dementia, we never told him about Mom since he would not have remembered, and it would have only caused him pain. But we all know stories of how one spouse dies shortly after another due to either a broken heart or losing the will to live. It makes me wonder whether on some level he just might have known. After having so many close calls with his health over many years that he somehow always miraculously pulled through, contrary to his physician's predictions. This time he lost his battle, but at least now he's together with Mom. I'd like to finish by reading a poem that some of you may know by Linda Ellis called The Dash. I find it to be very meaningful, especially during this holiday season and time of reflection. The Dash. I read of a man who stood to speak at the funeral of a friend. He referred to the dates on the tombstone from the beginning to the end. He noted that first came the date of birth and spoke of the following date with tears. But he said what mattered most of all was the dash between those years. For that dash represents all the time they spent alive on earth. And now only those who love them know what that little line is worth. For it matters not how much we own, the cars, the house, the cash. What matters is how we live and love and how we spend our dash. So think about this long and hard. Are there things you'd like to change? For you never know how much time is left that still can be rearranged. To be less quick to anger and show appreciation more and love the people in our lives like we've never loved before. If we treat each other with respect and more often wear a smile, remembering that this special dash might only last a little while. So when your eulogy is being read with your life's actions to rehash, would you be proud of the things they say about how you lived your dash? And yes, I'm sure Dad would be incredibly proud of how we know he lived his dash. Zichrono livracha. May his memory be for a blessing.
Took all the good parts. For the last decade or so, if not longer, every time I saw Grandpa Jack, I would shake his hand because he was, as Uncle Ralph mentioned and I like to say, a classic engineer and wasn't much for public displays of affection. And as I shook it, I would preempt the question that he always used to ask us, a question that still feels like an anachronism. How do you do? He would always respond, I do fine, thanks. How do you do? And regardless of what was really going on at the time, I would always respond back, I do fine too, thanks. To be honest, today I'm not fine. Let's just call a spade here in the spirit of being a straight talker like Grandpa Jack was. It's really crappy to have to say goodbye to 2 grandparents in under half a year, especially under the current circumstances. Even though Grandpa Jack was nearly 95 years old, this still hurts. But nonetheless, Grandpa Jack was a towering giant who deserves a regal send-off, so I will do my best to contribute some small measure to that farewell. Before I get started, there's one thing that bears mentioning. As he got older and his verbal filter progressively disappeared, Grandpa did not hesitate to make clear that he disliked my beard, which is why I shaved it before today. And he sometimes made other comments on my physical appearance too if there was something he didn't like. Grandpa, I know that I could stand to lose a few pounds, and I will work on it. Now that I've gotten that out of the way, I feel like I can give you the proper tribute that you deserve. In 1926, a baby boy was born to parents Ephros and Frida Silverman of Oneida, New York. All of us here today know him as Jack Stewart, or in some cases, Grandpa Jack or Dad, but he was born as Jack Silverman. And before anyone gets the impression that he was trying to run away from his past, that couldn't be further from the truth. He would always make sure that whatever silverware was being used had an Oneida stamp on the back. Any that didn't was immediately and vocally deemed subpar, whether it was at my parents' house for a Shabbat meal or at a restaurant in public right in front of the waiter. The story of why Grandpa Jack changed his name is at once an all-American story and profoundly speaks to his identity. Grandpa Jack graduated high school with honors and a resume that should have granted him entry into any of the most prestigious colleges of the day. But because of their quotas on the number of Jews admitted, he found gaining admission to be challenging. Syracuse University ultimately admitted him, and he spent his entire life repaying that debt. But more on that later. After graduating from Syracuse with a master's degree, Grandpa looked for employment as an engineer. Once again, because of his name, prospective employers balked at hiring a Jew. So, Grandpa Jack changed his name from Silverman to Stewart, and the floodgates of opportunity opened to him. However, it's important to note that even though circumstance forced him to outwardly hide part of his Jewish identity, far from trying to shed it, Grandpa Jack spent huge portions of his adult life working on behalf of an astounding number of Jewish causes. He almost single-handedly kept Magen David Adom in Cleveland afloat, served as president of Fairmount Temple and an usher for Friday night services for years, and served on the boards of the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, Siegel College of Jewish Studies, and Israel Bonds, among other numerous positions of leadership. On top of being a proud leader of the Jewish community, Grandpa Jack was a leader in so many other ways. He was a 33rd degree Mason. He was national vice president of the Syracuse Alumni Association and president of its Alumni Club of Northeast Ohio, spending almost his entire life repaying the debt to the university that admitted him when others would not. He was president of the Pepper Pike Civic League and served as a Republican ward leader for Pepper Pike too. Needless to say, for those of you who know my family, there was no shortage of passionate political discussion between my father and grandfather when they came over for a Shabbat or Yom Tov meal. The wall of the basement hallway in Grandma and Grandpa's house on Belcourt was jam-packed with awards and commendations honoring his achievements and his commitment to make our world better than it was in whatever way he could. But beyond all these accolades, Grandpa Jack was profoundly creative. Somehow, Grandpa found time to actively landscape and garden their 1-acre property in Pepper Pike, including riding around on his lawnmower, sometimes letting me drive, and making his own wine. He cooked food for the family, which, as my mom, aunt, and uncle will tell you, was definitely for the best. And I still remember him making pancakes in the morning after we slept over as little kids. He played piano, and in my mind, I can still see and hear him playing Moonlight Sonata on the Steinway in my parents' house. For years, Grandma and Grandpa devotedly watched the Browns with season tickets at the 50-yard line and had season tickets to Playhouse and the orchestra too. Grandpa built and ran his own business, Industrial Technological Associates, Inc. His workbench in the garage was second to none, with an extraordinary array of tools. He was even an early adopter of the internet and an avid computer user well into his late 80s. Juno, for those of you who know, was an email service that Grandpa used very faithfully. He was truly a Renaissance man. The most important thing Grandpa built was his family. In 1955, Grandpa Jack married Grandma Tootie, and for almost 65 years, they were a powerhouse of a team, in the truest sense of the term. Despite the difficulty of having lost both of them during this upside-down world we currently find ourselves in, there is some tragic beauty, some kind of awful poetry that even though he never knew Grandma Tootie passed away 5 months ago, his soul couldn't stay in this world for very long without hers in it too. Grandpa was never happier than when all of his children and grandkids would come to their house on Belcourt for a family barbecue over Memorial Day or Labor Day or for Thanksgiving. It was an idyllic scene of Americana right out of a Norman Rockwell painting. Grandchildren running around the yard or playing on the hammock or shooting a basketball while Grandpa Jack manned the grill and others milled around talking and eating and drinking. For dessert, invariably, we would have a delicious pie he made, whether it was apple or pumpkin or strawberry rhubarb. When we told him how we were doing in school, or as we got older about our professional accomplishments and communal involvements, the depth of his pride was obvious. Grandpa Jack was part of the greatest generation, and the accomplishments of his life live up to that name. He overcame adversity that none of us have ever had to know, and he did it while still maintaining his Jewish identity and ensuring that the next generations would thrive Jewishly too. The pain of losing him is going to sting for a while, but the strong family ties he built and the inspiration of his example of how to work tirelessly on behalf of the Jewish community, American society, higher education, Israel, and family and friends will help us cope. It hurts right now, but eventually, because of the strength he imparted to our parents and to us, we'll do fine too. We love you, Grandpa.
Beautiful, beautiful words of tribute. Hope it's okay. I've been leading services with it off, and so it's just a little bit easier to communicate, and I think I've got my 6 feet, so we'll do our best. For those who don't know me, which I think many of you do just because I officiated at Tootie's funeral with Rabbi Blau, Rabbi Josh Caruso of Fairmount Temple, I'm absolutely honored to be here, having known Jack all these years. I wanted to just, even before I just start with my formal eulogy, I wanted to share, we save everything at Fairmount Temple. So we have these files filled with just copies of every letter that was ever sent to every congregant. It's probably not the most efficient way of handling things, and maybe Jack wouldn't approve because of his engineering background. But it's wonderful because you find treasures. I found something already that I gave to Ralph, which was a note from Jack to Rabbi Lulliveld thanking him for officiating at the wedding for the great Ralphini. I found this picture from 1985. I'm going to give you a little of these treasures afterwards. A picture of him from 1985. And some wonderful notes from Rabbi Lulliveld. Jack, your many years of devotion, dedication, as well as recognized leadership has brought you to the high position of president of Fairmount Temple. This is on the onion paper. I want to send you a hearty mazel tov. I know your administrative qualities will lead us well. Please call on me whenever I can be helpful. I am eager to continue working with you. Tila joins me in warm good wishes and fond greetings to you and Tootie, 1984. This one I thought would interest Rabbi Blau. A note from Rabbi Lulliveld, a note from Rabbi Granitstein to Rabbi Lulliveld. Rabbi Lulliveld, I would like to invite you to participate in the marriage ceremony for Reuben Gutman and Eileen Stewart. My best regards to you. Then a note from Rabbi Lulliveld. Dear Rabbi Granitstein, I very much appreciate your invitation to participate in the marriage ceremony for Reuben Gutman and Eileen Stewart. I have known Eileen and her family so well for so many years that I shall happily look forward to being with them and with you on May 29th, 1983. So just some wonderful little treasures to be, and there's even a membership application from 1962. To be honest, because of the Chag, I didn't get to go through everything with a fine-tooth comb. If I find anything more that I think will be of interest to you, I will certainly give it to you. I'm just going to hand this to Ralph right Friends, we are in the space in the Jewish calendar that finds us between Yom Kippur and Sukkot. We have just moved through the days of awe. The Yomim Noraim are poised to enter into Zman Simchatenu, the season of our joy. So too, we are here in that liminal space between mourning and joyousness. For a pillar of our community, a patriarch in our community, and of cherished family, Jack leaves an incredible legacy. His resume alone is the kind that required more than a simple one-pager snapshot. Barry, you spoke to so many of his accomplishments, so forgive me if it's a little repetition, but maybe it's worthy of it. He was a civic leader of a par that really goes unmatched. President of the David Mark Berger chapter of American Friends of Magen David Adom for 13 years. He was feted for that. He was a leader in State of Israel Bonds, receiving its Heritage Award for service. He was a life member of the Jewish Chautauqua Society. He served on the Cemetery Preservation Committee of the Jewish Community Federation of Cleveland. Jack was also involved with the Jewish Republican Caucus here in Cleveland at a time when partisanship didn't sow such divisiveness as it does today. Raised as a Mason with his brother, Jack rose in leadership here in Cleveland, was proud of that affiliation, was honored with a proclamation from the city of Pepper Pike for being named Mason of the Year. He was a board member of the UAHC, which is now the Union for Reform Judaism, was active on Siegel College's library committee, and he was a past president of Anshe Chesed Fairmount Temple, both of the board, General Board of Trustees, and of the Brotherhood. I was fortunate enough to know Jack for the almost now 2 decades I've served at Fairmount Temple. I did not know him, though, in his heyday, to be honest. My memories of him are when, he's a little bit more compromised physically, and certainly with the hunch in the back, but, that kind of increasingly grew worse. But it was clear when I came to Temple in 2002 that he was a force, he was a force. His legacy had preceded him, and he was clearly still a force at Temple. He was in looking back at his membership application from 1962, which I just handed to you, he did, however, join the Temple's Young People's Congregation in 1960. So officially he joined the Temple in 1960. But if you belonged to the Young People's Congregation, which was called the YPC, you were kind of like a junior member of Fairmount Temple. It was a kind of a bridge to Fairmount Temple. So once you kind of grew up and you were no longer like a young family, you could enter the temple kind of in its main form, and you had to submit a separate application for that in 1962. He did that. In the space where the form asks, what is your interest in congregational activities, Jack wrote, all phases. Indeed, he hit the ground running from the get-go, and it is no surprise in light of his previous stint, which I didn't know. He was the vice president at the West Temple before he came to Fairmount. He quickly got involved in the business of running the temple, steadily rising up in the ranks. Jack developed a special relationship with Rabbi Lulliveld, who co-officiated at weddings for his children. It is clear that he viewed himself as a custodian of temple life. And while he was not traditionally observant, he was religious about attending Shabbat services every week. He served as an usher for over 40 years. I could still see him and Tootie in my mind's eye, wearing their carnations right here on the lapel, handing out prayer books. Jack's devotion to temple was second to none, and Jack and Tootie were always together. They were a pair. They shared the same sensibilities. They were a power couple at Temple, no question. They loved being members of Fairmount, and they created a community of lifelong friends. A stalwart group of Temple peers, with a stalwart group of Temple peers, they created a Friday night study group, which met after services to talk about topical issues of the day. We were talking about this on the phone when we all were sort of preparing for the funeral. Just a couple of days ago, how Jack really represented that like kind of classical Reform Jew, the past. It was like you didn't necessarily wear your Judaism on your sleeve out in the world, but you were incredibly proud of who you were. It just was a different kind of observance, but incredibly like tending to your Judaism, that you were a custodian of your Judaism. He was very proud of that, very proud of like the intellectual thrust of Judaism, and that really, in the Reform movement, when it came to America, years ago, really like late 1800s, that Reform Judaism was, the spirituality of Judaism really came through the learning. That was where it wasn't so much the davening, but it was definitely like the learning and that the sort of intellectual pursuits. He was a lifelong learner. He believed that being a good Jew meant knowing how to live and think like one. He was interested in the sermons that were given, liked to give feedback to his rabbis. He liked to give feedback to his rabbis. I was joking, we were sharing this the other day, that when I first came to Fairmount Temple, I just wanted sort of people to feel familiarity with me, so sometimes I would like lean on the pulpit like this. He came up after me after services, he goes, Rabbi, great service, but don't lean on the lectern. So, did it bother you? Like, I didn't realize. He says, it's a little sloppy. I said, okay. He had thrown it down right there. He's like, okay. So, and I thought, but here's a person, if you take a step back, you recognize here's a person who cared about, and that's, by the way, a very hallmark of classical Reform Judaism too, right? The decorousness of the service. Everything is dignified, not a lot of talking during the service. All of those things were very important to him. Of course, a post-service Oneg conversation with Jack wasn't complete without a well-thought-out quip or joke, delivered with his inimitable wink and smile, that grin. You can see it now, right? That grin. Sometimes he'd sit there and you could see the joke was in his head. The machinations were going on. And I was standing there and he's like, so Rabbi, and I'd wait. And you could see him almost entertained by the fact that he was going to tell this joke. He already knew how fun, and so he kind of like marinated in it for a moment, and then he would tell it to me. He moved around every Shabbat evening Oneg, confident in his leadership, proud of his temple standing, his temple life. And yes, he was born Jack Silverman, the brother of Herbert, Zichrono Livracha. And is that right, Herbert? Yep. Yeah. The Silverman, of course, sounded a little too Jewish, and amazing story. And I've known him a long time. Red never knew that story, which is really incredible. But he always resolved to live his life as a proud Jew, nonetheless. He was a talented engineer, graduating magna cum laude from Syracuse University. He worked for General Electric and the government as a consultant before starting his own business. He was self-made in every way. And sometimes it was the hard way that he took. I think it came up in our conversation that Jack swam upstream a lot. Like that was, his life was kind of like hard and tough, and he pushed, and he had that edge where he could succeed. And yes, he loved the gardening and the fixing things around the house, the wine and the grape preserves, and cooking and making brunch, right? The Russian cheese pancakes. He was a Don Quixote enthusiast, a Cleveland Browns devotee, going to every home game since he acquired season tickets in 1964. And Jack and Tootie, of course, raised 3 loving children, Eileen, Leslie, and Ralph, who brought them grandchildren, and great-grandchildren followed. It added a perfect silver lining to their lives. I invited some of the grandchildren to share some with me, so I hope I covered everybody who sent me stuff. But just as we did with Tootie, I think it was really helpful to sort of get that glimpse. So I thank everyone. I know some probably are watching on stream right now, so I thank you all if for those of you who could not be here today. I'm just going to share. Adam said, when I was 6 years old, Grandpa and Grandma took me to my very first football game, a preseason game under the lights, and the first season the Browns returned to play. I remember them coming over to pick me up with Grandpa specifically diagramming out on a piece of paper how football is played. We then got to ride the Rapid together to and from the game, which was a big deal for 6-year-old me. It was great for Grandpa to pass on his love of football and the Browns to me, especially as we went to more games together in the future, and that has stayed with me throughout the rest of my life. Talia. One of my favorite memories of Grandpa Jack was when he and Grandma would host holiday barbecues. One of my favorite foods is beef ribs on the bone. Since my dad hates beef ribs and restaurants typically only serve pork ribs, it was a real treat for me to go to Grandpa Jack's barbecues. He always had beef ribs sizzling on the grill and, of course, a bottle of ketchup to go with them. The Stewart family barbecues always ended with at least 5 of us kids in their backyard hammock and somebody having to tell Grandpa that we broke it. Again. Carly. Ever since my senior year of high school, once I committed to Vanderbilt, we would always remind Grandpa Jack where I was going to for college when we visited him. Every time I told him I was going to Vanderbilt, he would ask, why? I think that we all know what the real question was. Why not Syracuse? Ultimately, though, Grandpa Jack was very proud of all of his grandchildren and their accomplishments. And I think that that connection with Syracuse was because they accepted him, right, as a Jew, and he really felt a sense of allegiance to that university at a time when you couldn't bank on the fact that any university was going to accept him. And I noticed that he developed, established a fund, right, a scholarship fund at Syracuse. Marissa. Some of my fondest memories of Grandpa Jack were of the wonderful meals he used to make us. What made them so special was not only that Grandpa made it for us, but how they were so unique. Whether these were his specialty pancakes with cottage cheese barbecues, matzo brie, or omelet. To this day, I still don't know what he put in his omelets, but I just remember I love them, and I will forever know them by Grandpa's omelets. Ralph, didn't you say, I think it was a little bit mixture of everything left in the fridge? Yeah. Julia. When I was younger, my mom and I went to Cleveland, just the 2 of us. Grandpa Jack picked us up from the airport. He met us in the terminal like he and Grandma always did when we came to Cleveland. When we got to the car, my mom realized that she forgot my booster seat back in Colorado. Grandpa Jack began looking through the car and pulled out 2 phone books. He said, this was practically the same thing as a booster seat. So for the rest of the trip, I sat on phone books. Engineer. Grandpa Jack was always a quick thinker, loved to make jokes. Every time we visited Cleveland, we stayed at Grandpa Jack and Grandma Tootie's house. Without a doubt, sometime during our visit, we would find Grandpa in the kitchen eating his cereal with bananas. I remember that my sisters and I would sit at the table with him talking about our lives or the birds and deer that were in the backyard. It is a small and simple memory, but it describes how you never had to do anything big with Grandpa. You could just sit with him at the kitchen table. I love you, Grandpa. Sarah. One of my most cherished memories with Grandpa Jack was when he and I made my Hanukkah. I had brought back 9 ceramic pieces from an archaeological dig in Israel, which were supposedly linked to the time of the Maccabees. So I decided to make a Hanukkah out of them. Grandpa Jack and I spent days making it. We had to pick out specific wood and paint and have special glasses to hold the oil. Grandpa, of course, was incredibly meticulous and had to measure out each individual piece so that they were perfectly even. Ever since making that Hanukkah with Grandpa Jack, I make sure to bring out that 4-foot-long Hanukkah so that I can use it on Hanukkah. 4 foot long is what she wrote. It is one of my most special possessions. Thank you, Grandpa. I love you. Love, Sarah. And Jack's son-in-law, Stewart, wanted to share these words. One of the best gifts I ever received came from my father-in-law. We had been recently married and we were visiting Cleveland. He called me into a side room saying he had something for me. He reached behind the bed and pulled out a heavy nondescript bag and gave it to me with the simple phrase, "Here you go." Inside was a wide range of tools, all from Sears, with lifetime guarantees. Some were standard stuff and others were unusual. You could tell that they were bought at different times and with great thought. I greatly treasured that gift for both its practicality and symbolism. These tools have saved me multiple trips to the hardware store and money on repairs. They also represented being self-sufficient and willing to learn new skills. I suspect the lifetime warranty was also a hint on how he wanted the marriage to go. Don't tell my children. But something is in the offing. Okay, so I want to say that we have a lot of incredible stories that these only touch the surface. But I want to say that we are in this space between Yom Kippur and Sukkot, approaching this Zman Simchatenu, this time of joy. And, it is this liminal space. And I think we can look back on these days of awe, on Yamim Noraim, of reverence. A lot of ways we liken the idea of how we observe, how we think of our relationship with God as a parent. And the kind of reverence that we show for a parent, the kind of awe that we show for a parent, we magnify that, right? We show the same to God. And Jack was a lion. He was a patriarch. He was a force. And he had these kind of royal, kingly, elements to him. And yet he could cook meals for you at the same time and make wine and do those simple things and garden. And so we look back on his life with lots of reverence and lots of awe at what he's achieved. So much. And we also look to the future, this Zman Simchatenu, this time of joy. And maybe even in these moments today, we've laughed a little bit and thought about his life. We can already pull a little bit of the joy out. Every year it's traditional on Sukkot to invite Ushpizin, our guests. And of course it's traditional to invite our patriarchs. Some invite the matriarchs too. But I always like to invite folks in our congregants to invite family members too, ancestors, those who made a real impact in our lives. I always ask, who would you invite? Who would you invite? And so let's invite Jack to our Sukkot this year. Let's let's invite him and have his spirit with us underneath that rickety canopy right there. But it'll remind us of just even by building the Sukkot, remind us of his skills, using some things out of the toolbox, and so let us walk in that space. And as you are able, we invite you to rise now for El Malei Rachamim, the memorial prayer. El Malei Rachamim, Shochein Bamromim, Hamsei Menucha Nechona, Tachat Kanfei Hashchina, Bemalot Kedoshim Mutorim, Kezor Rakia Mazirim, Et Nishmat Yehuda Moshe ben Ephraim Ufredo Shalach Leolamo Began Eden Tehei Menuchato Ana Balarachamim Hastirehu בסתר כנפיך לעולמים, וצרור בצרור החיים את נשמתו, אדוני ונחלתו, וינוח בשלום על משכבו, ונאמר אמן. El Malei Rachamim, exalted, compassionate God, grant infinite rest in your sheltering presence among the holy and the pure to the soul of Jack Stewart, who has gone to his eternal home. Merciful One, we ask that our loved one find perfect peace in your eternal embrace. May his soul be bound up in the bond of life. May he rest in peace. And let us say, Amen. At this time, the conclusion of our service, we want to once again recognize, acknowledge that Jack leaves a lasting legacy. Eileen and Reuben, Leslie and Stewart, Ralph and Rachel, and of course his grandchildren, Barry and Samantha, Suzanne and Isaac, Caroline and Shmuel, Sarah, Marissa, Julia, Adam and Meredith, Talia and Carly, great-grandfather of Elliot, Jack, Gabriel, and Ethan. May his memory be a blessing. Amen. Birth is a beginning and death a destination, but life is a journey, a going, a growing from stage to stage, from childhood to maturity and youth to age, from innocence to awareness and ignorance to knowing, from foolishness to discretion and then perhaps to wisdom, from weakness to strength or strength to weakness and often back again, from health to sickness and back we pray to health again, from offense to forgiveness, from loneliness to love, from joy to gratitude and from pain to compassion and grief to understanding, from fear to faith, from defeat to defeat to defeat, until looking backward or ahead we see that victory lies not at some high place along the way, but in having made the journey stage by stage a sacred pilgrimage. Birth is a beginning, death a destination, but life is a journey, a sacred pilgrimage made stage by stage, from birth to death to life everlasting. I'd like to share a few more comments from the grandchildren. Barry wrote, I remember as a kid that in his office he had a computer that I used to go play with when we would go over to their house. There weren't really any games, but it did have internet access. For years he was always eager to be an early adopter of various different technologies, including email, but he was also someone who had really had strong habits that he didn't like to deviate from. I always found that kind of an interesting paradox. And then we talked about the Juno account, right? Great. I also remember that when we would sleep over their house on occasion, I would try to find cereal for myself in the morning and would inevitably be disappointed because all they had were grape nuts, plain Cheerios, and regular Raisin Bran. They also had cream of wheat, which is a food I still don't understand even today. However, on rare occasion, they would also have smacks, which was by far the best option. I also remember them only having skim milk and not understanding why anyone would do that, because it was just white water. Suzanne, I remember bringing Ike to their house for the first time. Grandma and Grandpa brought us to their formal living room to sit and chat. They needed to get to know this man who was going to become their first grandchild-in-law. Ike asked about the 3 crystal decanters sitting on the table next to Grandma Tootie's personalized chocolate dish filled with alcohol. Yes. The decanter was filled with alcohol, not the chocolate. Okay, when Ike asked about them, Grandpa said it was wine he had made himself and he insisted Ike taste it. That wine had been there for longer than I could remember. It must have been 20 plus years old and vinegar at that point, but he poured Ike a glass and as fine as crystal and insisted Ike drink it anyways.
Which he faked because he was scared for his life.
I was gonna say, you didn't talk about the outcome, but he's still living.
He's still
This is good.
alive.
Okay, good. Caroline, always wanted a good back scratch. Somehow put up with our squishing his cheeks, grill master, Grandma and Grandpa sitting at the kitchen table reading newspapers, trying to convince us all to go to Syracuse U. Driving to CVS and Mark's with Grandma, and they'd always buy huge chocolate bars. Shmuel witnessed that once. Usher at Fairmount Temple would meet us at the house after for Shabbos dinner, sleeping until 1 to 2 in the afternoon and being awake into the night. Driving his own tractor, a basement filled with old wines, making his own horseradish, all of the food he made for breakfast after Yom Kippur, tuna noodle salad with all of the fridge ingredients, deviled eggs, etc. Thank you. Great. I'm glad we could include that.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I'll include these in the eulogy. I'll send you a copy of it so you have it.
Thank you.
Rabbi?
I just want to conclude with the course of the ceremony that we had today. The powerful, powerful memories that everybody has were so evocative. And I say that he'll live on in your hearts forever. And so many of you emulate his various characteristics. And that in that sense, his memory will be a blessing by definition. All the things he accomplished, the wonderful family he built, and the real true legacy that he leaves. I'm going to end by just saying a parak of Tehillim, and then we'll say the regular mourner's Kaddish. It's Kuf Kaf Aleph 121. Shir Lamalot Esayna L'Rimi Ayin Yavo Ezri Yezri Me'im Adonai Yosei Shemayim Va'aretz Ayite lemodrak lecha yanum shomrecha. Hinei lo yanum v'lo yishan shomer Yisrael. Adonai shomrecha. Adonai tzolchad yad yaminecha. Yamam hashemesh lo yakecha. V'yareach b'aloi lo. Adonai yishmarcha mikol ra yishmar et nafshecha. Adonai yishmar tizka bo'echa me'ata v'yad olam. A song to ascend, to lift my eyes to the mountains. From where will my help come? Your help comes from the Lord, maker of heaven and earth. God will not let your foot falter, your guardian will not slumber. Behold, the guardian of Israel neither slumber nor sleeps. The Lord is your guardian, the Lord is your protection by your right side. By day the sun will not harm you, nor the moon by night. The Lord will guard you from all evil, the Lord will guard your life. The Lord will guard your going and coming from now and forever. We'll now say the Kaddish. Amen.
Yalma Divra Kurte, Yam Lim Lafute, Kaye Hon, Yom Kaye, Kol Beit Israel, Hagala, Bisman Kari, V'Imru, Amen. Yeshei Rabam Nevorach, Leolam, Ulemayayim, Yidit Barach, V'Yishtabach, V'Yitpa'ar, V'Yitraman, V'Yitnaseh, V'Yitadar, V'Yitalev, V'Yitalal, Shmei Kudashah, V'Yilu, V'Yalel, Yikol, Berkata, Shirata, Tishbachata, V'Nechamata, Damiran, V'Yalma, V'Imru, Amen. V'Yei Shlama Rabba Min Shemaya, V'Chaim Aleinu V'Yakol Yisrael, V'Imru, Amen. Asher Shalom, V'Imromav, Asher Shalom, Aleinu V'Yakol Yisrael, V'Imru, Amen.
Conclude the service.